So today we have an interview with the developers of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy where they address the sales performance for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and honestly, the game's probably doing just fine. We're also going to take a look at some more tidbits that have come out from the Material Ultimania in regards to 7 Rebirth. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button, and if you're new here and you'd like to stick around and help support the channel, you can subscribe, and as always, leave your thoughts in the comments down below. So the sales numbers for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth are something that have been hotly debated over this past year. We've even covered it a few times here on the channel, and according to Square Enix, Rebirth and even games like Final Fantasy XVI did not meet their lofty sales expectations. Now when it comes to Square Enix's sales expectations, they are pretty high, but there are some realistic standards that are set with those expectations because while we don't know what the budgets for these games are, we can assume that they are probably pretty big, which means that the games in turn have to perform really well to break even and then eventually become profitable. Now when it comes to game sales, there are a number of factors that go into them. A game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, for example, was developed on Unreal Engine 4, which was created by Epic Games. So Epic gets a cut of that game because they used their engine to develop on it. There's also merchant fees, so places like Amazon, Best Buy, Target, the PlayStation Store, when they sell a copy of this game, they also get a percentage of that game's sale. So a game like Rebirth, which sold for $70 standard, ends up being maybe a $30 to $40 profit for Square Enix. And that's just to kind of hammer home the fact that these games really do need to sell well to recoup those costs. Now, usually a lot of these game studios do have multiple sales goals internally that they want their games to hit. And based on some of the rumors that have been flying around, Rebirth apparently sold 2 million units in its first month of release and did eventually hit some of those internal goals at Square Enix. It just didn't meet that really massive one, whatever that number was. And since the release of Rebirth, Square has not acknowledged how well Rebirth has performed. They've not given any sales data. We've kind of just gone off of groups like Circana and even things like the PlayStation Partner Awards. But thank you to an interview from IGN Brazil who sat down with Yoshinori Kitase at the Game Awards, we now have a clearer picture on how well Rebirth performed. Kitase goes on to say, in terms of sales expectations, Sony held the PlayStation Partner Awards in Japan, and there was a category, the Grand Award, in which they awarded the 3 best-selling games. Rebirth was one of them, alongside Black Myth Wu-Tang and Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. So I think being recognized in this aspect gives me the certainty that we have reached a certain level. Now we did cover the PlayStation Partner Awards when they did happen, however if you're new here I can give you guys a recap of what went down at that event. Now this Grand Award is essentially like the Game of the Year award from PlayStation that they give to 3 games. Now how do they figure out what games get this award? It's not based on a fan vote, and it's not based on developer votes, it's based entirely on sales. So the 3 best-selling Asian games get awarded the Grand Award. So if Rebirth got one of those awards, then that means that the game probably sold decently, has legs, and regardless of whether or not Square wants to say the exact number, it probably did sell relatively well. And if we look at the numbers via Circana, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is the 15th best-selling game of 2024. And in that top 15, Rebirth is the only console exclusive, which is pretty impressive. Now, one of the biggest things that is clearly holding games like Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI back from selling even more copies is that console exclusivity, which Kitase actually mentions. He goes on to say, while we are confident and happy that we are reaching a certain level of sales, it is clear that with the modernity of games, we cannot be exclusive to a single platform. I think we need to offer the game to as many players as possible. And when Kitase says modernity, that just essentially means like the modern era of how games are sold and publicized and marketed. There are so many games out there on so many platforms, it's a lot harder to get noticed these days. And in order to get noticed, you really got to make sure that these games are available on as many platforms as possible day and date of that game's release. Now, one of the things that is, again, holding these games back is that console exclusivity with Sony, and that is a bit of a double-edged sword. In the case of Rebirth, this entire trilogy, its budget, and its exclusivity was decided probably around 10 years ago. And I want to bring that up because I know there's a lot of people who see, oh, well, maybe Rebirth underperformed. Does that mean it'll affect the budget of Part 3? That's not the case. All of these numbers, the budgets, that's all been figured out a very, very long time ago, and that's already been set in stone. Now, when it comes to that big check that Sony cut for Square Enix, it was great in the short term because it helped to fund this project. They probably threw a lot of gil at Square Enix to keep it exclusive to PlayStation, and with all of that money, they could try to make the best game that they possibly could with Remake, with Rebirth, and now Part 3. The downside, though, is in the long term, you're now stuck on one platform, and it's a platform that is not as big as something like the PlayStation 4, which is the PlayStation 5 install base. Now, the game is set to release on PC on January 23rd, and it looks like a lot of people are actually willing to spend the money on pre-ordering it because it's been hovering around the top 15 to top 10 on the Steam sales chart, so clearly people have been waiting to play this game. And moving away from that console exclusivity is something Square Enix addressed earlier this year. They realized, yeah, we can no longer take these big checks from specific companies to keep our games locked to that platform because it's eventually gonna hurt us. So shifting to a multi-platform focus is something that Square Enix is already going to do, and of course they are going through a lot of restructuring right now, and it does take time to kind of figure that out. And you're probably wondering, well, what does that mean for 7 Remake Part 3? Well, unfortunately, that probably means that Remake Part 3 will not release on PC or an Xbox day and date. It'll most likely be a 7 Remake and Rebirth situation where it comes out, then has a specific window of exclusivity, then heads to PC, and then maybe eventually Xbox. And I could totally see them doing a re-release where they package all 3 games together into a bundle and then sell it on PS5, PC, and Xbox. But I don't think they're gonna stitch all the games together. I've seen some people say like, whoa, do you think they're gonna take Remake and Rebirth and Part 3 and connect them into one big game? I don't think they would do that, and I don't think they can because the game logic of these games is pretty different. The combat system in particular is different, so I think if you were to do that, you would have to rebalance every single game, every enemy, every boss fight, because your stuff would carry over from Remake into the Rebirth portion of the game into Remake Part 3, and I think it would just be a little too messy. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, what about Nintendo? When is Final Fantasy VII going to come to the Nintendo? Well, it's not coming to the Switch. I don't think the Switch could handle this trilogy. They would have to make some big sacrifices in the technical aspects of things to get it to run on a Switch. But the rumored follow-up for the Switch 2, is said to be somewhere on the power level of a PlayStation 4 Pro. And if that is the case, then 7 Remake could run on a Switch 2 no problem. Rebirth, I think you'd have to make some sacrifices to that game's visuals and the frame rates to get it working on a Switch 2, but who knows? That's kind of up in the air when it comes to the Switch. But an Xbox Series X could handle these games no problem. A Series S would also probably take some small downgrades in the performance, but at the end of the day, it would work just fine. And the fact that Kitase actually addressed the sales, I think is really nice because now it just kind of puts a nice little pin into the conversation of, well, did Rebirth do well? Did it meet expectations? Is it a failure? It's gonna be fine. It's a great game. It's clearly got legs, and those legs will only grow longer with the PC release, and then eventually maybe an Xbox or Switch release. So thanks, Kitase. You helped us out on that one. So moving away from sales talk, let's talk about new tidbits from the 7 Remake Trilogy. We're pulling from the Ultimania here, but we're also pulling from some older articles that kind of have some relevance in regards to the trilogy and what they're doing with the story. And for all of this information, we're going to be sourcing the Shinra Archaeology Department over on Twitter, which is a fantastic account, especially if you love Final Fantasy VII. They're constantly posting cool tidbits from old articles and Ultimanias that are super fascinating. Great group of people over there. I highly suggest you give them a follow. So starting off first, this actually comes to us from PC Games from 2022, and this is about Crisis Core. Is it connected to the Remake Trilogy? And to answer that, we go to Kitase and Nomura, who say that's a tough question to answer because of course we haven't revealed everything there is to reveal about the 7 Remake Trilogy. The question implies that the original Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake do not exist in the the same timeline. And the truth is, we still have mysteries in that regard that we haven't revealed yet. How the story ends up, where it's going, is a huge mystery, so I can't give you a direct answer. However, Crisis Core's story is relevant to the original 7. It takes place in the same timeline, but it is also relevant in part of the remake's timeline. So the games are not independent of each other. Unfortunately, I can't go into more detail at the moment without spoilers. And I remember when Crisis Core Reunion was getting ready to release, a lot of us were like, oh, is this going to connect to 7 Remake in the trilogy? Is there going to be some sort of change at the end of this game? Because we knew what happened at the end of 7 Remake where Zack survived. It changed the ending of Crisis Core. So some of us were wondering, are we going to see that ending in Reunion? Is this going to connect? And it doesn't. And based on how Kitase and Nomura talk about it, the original FF7 and Crisis Core, and even Crisis Core Reunion, are all within the same world. And based on what we know about the 7 Remake Trilogy and how they're handling all of this multiverse stuff, it's actually not even a multiverse story. There's different worlds within the live stream, but there's one live stream that connects all these different worlds. So one world you have OG FF7 and Crisis Core, including Crisis Core Reunion. And then in another world, we have the 7 Remake Trilogy. So again, it's not a multiverse thing. There's one unifying live stream that has all of these different worlds. So I would say essentially they are connected just through that live stream, but they're not the same kind of, existence, so to speak. But essentially the same events of the original FF7 are playing out in the Remake Trilogy, albeit a little bit differently. Now up next, they have a very controversial section of Rebirth, and that has to do with Dyne and the fight you have with him. So Shinra Archaeology Department goes on to say, Boss Battle Design Coordinator Tomotaka Shirochi says the order for Dyne's boss model was a monstrous iron person covered in scrap metal. One of the other concepts was for the scrap metal to cover him all over like a full body armor suit. They continue by saying, in the final phase of the Dyne boss fight in Rebirth, the replication chip in Dyne's illegally modified prosthetic arm activates, causing the gun to organically overtake his body. Which I don't recall if they explicitly state that in the game. I just remember battling Dyne and all of a sudden he gets this Resident Evil Ouroboros arm that comes out of the gun and starts sucking up all the metal around him. Now again, this is a point of controversy because it's different than how it plays out in the original. Personally, while I enjoy how Rebirth handles it, I think the original does it better because it feels so much more depressing and sad. So in the original, you find Dyne, you have a conversation, Barrett unfortunately can't get through to him, you have your battle, and because it's a turn-based battle, I think things feel a little less frenetic, they feel a little bit more intimate. You have the battle, Dyne is wounded, and he ends up taking himself out. He realizes my daughter cannot see me the way that I am, and I'm no longer that same person, and I don't think I can become that person again. So he literally offs himself. It's heartbreaking, super sad. If I remember correctly, there's not even any music playing. It's just silence. You hear the wind, you read the text, Dyne's gone. It's really beautifully done. In Rebirth, I feel like before and after the fight, the interactions with Barrett and Dyne are beautifully done, well performed. You feel the loss, you feel the heartbreak. I think that still replicates what they had in the original. The issue, I think for a lot of people, and even me, is the boss battle itself. It feels really high octane, action packed, a little too high key for what the situation calls for, but it's also kind of a double-edged sword because the nature of Rebirth's combat is so high action, it's fast paced, it's super incredibly fun and dynamic. So how do you make a depressing, sad, intimate battle with that kind of battle system? Because on the flip side of it, I don't know how they would have crafted that fight to feel like it did in the original, to make it feel more intimate, more personal. Because you don't want to turn it into a mini game where suddenly it's Gears of War and Barrett is hiding behind rubble and Dyne is hiding behind rubble and it's a basic shootout. Although now that I think about it, you probably could have done that. And you could have replicated how it was in the original. No music, the sound of wind, maybe you hear chatter from the party as they're afraid for Barrett's life as well as Dyne. But while I enjoyed it, I again do think it's done better in the original, and I would consider this not even really a misstep, but kind of like the only small blemish on Rebirth in particular. But again, I really don't know how you do that battle in a way that replicates the original. For those of you who have more ideas or better ideas than me, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. How would you handle Dyne's boss battle in Rebirth to make it feel as impactful as it did in the OG game? Up next, we hear a little bit about Roche, where they go on to say, in Rebirth, Roche has been modified by Hojo using Sephiroth cells. The SC4 tattoo he bears on his shoulder is evidence of Hojo's new experimental procedure. They then go on to talk about how he is degrading much faster and also taking on aspects of Sephiroth, and we even see Roche get into that Sephiroth pose. Now, as for Roche, I really loved his addition into this remake trilogy. He starts off as this really psychotic third-class soldier who is tasked with finding Cloud and bringing him to justice or whatnot, and he's a bit of a lunatic who is incredibly eccentric. But that's the thing with soldiers. Every soldier has some sort of eccentric personality quirk that is dialed up to 11. For Roche, it's that adrenaline rush, it's the beauty in battle, it's that poetry, which is why he connects so much with Cloud, because he feels like he's finally found either an equal or someone that is better than him that he can surpass to then improve his own abilities. Genesis gets extreme about Loveless, constantly reading it, reciting the poetry. He's a bit of an emo edgelord, so I guess you could say that's his eccentricity. With Zack, even he has it. He's on the lower end of the scale because he's still a good dude, but he kind of has that obsession with, you know, being a hero. He wants to be a great hero within Shinra. So for Roche to kind of go from being that guy who first encounters Cloud to ultimately really respecting him and viewing him as a friend is really beautifully done. And for Roche, it's not about killing Cloud, it's not about helping Shinra capture Cloud, it's all a personal thing to him. He just wants to see, is he as good as Cloud, if not better? And when you have that encounter with him in Junon and you beat him, you've earned his respect. And he's proud. He's like, damn, like, I would consider you my friend, I grant you safe passage, and I'm gonna be right behind you. Which makes the next time they see each other so heartbreaking, because by that time, he's been experimented on by Hojo, and he is slowly degrading, and then it snaps, and he starts to degrade really fast. And he meets Cloud in the party outside of the Nibelheim mansion, and boy did he kick my ass in that battle. I was getting tossed around because he's so much stronger and faster in that confrontation. But eventually you beat him, and unfortunately he turns into a black robe, which is super sad to see that happen to a character like Roche, because he's being taken advantage of by Hojo, by Shinra, to basically become a mindless drone. Now, Cloud and Roche do see each other one more time at the Temple of the Ancients. And at this point, while Roche is a black robe, he still has some of his own mind that's working. And he points Cloud and the party in the direction of Sephiroth, and then he mumbles the words, "My friend." Which is so sad, I'm gonna make myself cry. But that is not the end for Roche, because as the temple collapses, we see he is the only black robe that makes it out and sent back to Midgar. So Roche 100% will probably show up again in part 3. He might be one of the bosses we fight on the parachute back into Midgar as we make our way to Hojo. Maybe he's the boss before Hojo. Maybe he's able to fight off some of that black robe energy and kind of do something that allows him to sacrifice himself while also saving Cloud and the party. I think that would be a really poetic end for a character that is incredibly poetic. And the last thing we will end on is the battle where Cloud and Zack are fighting Sephiroth in different worlds. The SAD goes on to say, in the battle against Sephiroth Reborn in Rebirth, Zack disappears to a different layer, leaving Cloud in a world where only 7 seconds remain till its collapse. So we do see that split happen. Sephiroth's like, okay, I'm done with you two ganging up on me. I'm gonna send Zack away to a world that's gonna die. There's a meteor there. Have fun, Zack. And then Cloud is left to fend fend for himself. And that line right there, 7 seconds remain until its collapse, connects all the way back to the end of 7 Remake, 7 seconds till the end, time enough for you perhaps, but what will you do with it? Now we do address this in an upcoming community video because someone asked me what my thoughts were on the 7 seconds thing, and my mind goes immediately to Meteor. I think in part 3, there's probably going to be a moment where Cloud has to make a decision within 7 seconds that will either affect him and the party or maybe his relationship with Sephiroth. So the whole 7 seconds thing might just be connected to Meteor and its destruction to the planet, because that's what's happening here in Rebirth, 7 seconds until that world is eventually going to collapse. A lot of people back in the day thought that 7 seconds was a reference to the death of Aerith, and maybe Cloud would have 7 seconds to try and figure out how to save her. But as far as I know, this hasn't been explicitly addressed other than what we're getting here in this Ultimania, so I still think it's up for grabs in part 3. But that's still one of the biggest mysteries for me. It lives in my head rent-free. I gotta know what's 7 seconds until the end actually mean. But with that being said, that is the video. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys thought on what we covered today, whether it was sales for Rebirth, the Dyne boss battle, or 7 seconds till the end, or even what you thought about Roche. I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.